Okay, in order to install SQL Server on macOS or Linux, we need to use a tool called Docker, which basically automates and simplifies the deployment of applications. And it solves the issue that your application works on your machine, but when you deploy it to a different machine, it doesn't work. With Docker, we package our application along with all its dependencies and configuration settings into an image. And then we can deploy this image to a different machine with only one command. This command will load our application with all its dependencies into what we call a container. Now, SQL Server for Linux comes as a Docker image, which means the software along with all its dependencies are packaged inside this image. And we're going to use this image to install it on our machine. So, if you haven't installed Docker, simply head over to docker.com. On Docker website, go to this page, Get Docker. And here you can find downloads for Windows, macOS, and different distributions of Linux. Now, after you install Docker, the first thing you need to do is to configure the memory allocation. So, here's the Docker icon. Click. You can see Docker is running. Sometimes you may run into issues. You can simply restart it here. Now let's go to Preferences. On this page, in the Advanced tab, look, here I have set the memory to 4 gigabytes. By default, it's 2 gigabytes, so you need to increase it to 4 gigabytes in order to run SQL Server image. Once you do that, it's going to take a few seconds until Docker is restarted. Now in Terminal, let's make sure Docker is running. So simply type Docker. Beautiful. Now we need to pull the SQL Server image from Docker registry. So sudo docker pull Microsoft/ms SQL-server-linux. With this, we download the SQL Server image into our machine. All right, now we want to run this image inside a container. So sudo docker run. We need to set an environment variable -e accept _EULA, which stands for End User License Agreement. We set this to Y. And note that I have put this environment variable inside single quotes. Next, we need to set another environment variable. So -e. This one is SA password. And here we need to use a complex password. If you use a weak password, you're going to get a runtime exception. And I'm going to talk about that later in this video. So, to make sure that you will have a smooth experience as you're going through this course, use the password that I'm going to use in this video. My with capital M, complex with capital C, password with capital P, exclamation mark 234, and close the single quote. Next, we need to map a port in our container to a port in our host machine. So -P for the port, 1433 to 1433. So we're mapping the port 1433 in our container to this port on our host machine. And we're going to use this port when connecting to SQL Server from our web application. Now, if you're using Linux, you can also map a volume in the container to a volume on your host machine. And this will allow you to persist your database between container executions. So if you restart your container, if you restart your machine, your database is going to stay there. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this video, this feature is not supported on Mac. However, if you're on Linux, you add -v for mapping the volume. First, you add the volume on the host machine, like user, my, database, that's the folder, that's the path, colon to map. And then you add /var /opt/ms SQL. Once again, this doesn't work on Mac, so I'm going to remove it. Next, we add -d to run this as a background service. And finally, we need to add the name of our image. That's the image we downloaded earlier. So Microsoft/ms SQL-server-linux. Okay, beautiful. SQL Server is running. Now here, unlike Windows, we don't have SQL Server Management Studio. So if you want to connect to your database, there are two ways. If you're on Linux, head over to this link on the screen, bit.ly/SQL Server Tools. This is a page on the Microsoft website. And here you can see the instructions for installing SQL Server command line tools for various distributions of Linux. But if you're on a Mac, you can use SQL Pro, which is similar to SQL Server Management Studio. So simply head over to mac.sqlclient.com, and by the way, this is a commercial application. There is a trial version, which is I think about 30 days, and then you need to get a license, but that's reasonably cheap. It's only about 100 Australian dollars, which is about perhaps 70 US dollars. Once you run SQL Pro, you can go to Connect. On this window, go to New. Here we add the server name, which is localhost. For authentication, we're going to use SQL Server Authentication with SA as the username, and password is going to be my complex password, exclamation mark 234. Save. Beautiful. This shows that our server is online. So we connect to the server. Now currently we don't have any databases here, but later in the course, when we create our database, we can come back here, look at our tables, look at our data, run queries, and so on. Now, what if something goes wrong while you're running this SQL Server image? Let me show you how to troubleshoot this problem. So I have opened another terminal window. I want to show you the Docker containers that are currently running. So Docker PS. You can see I have one container. This is the ID of my container. This is the image that this container is based on, which is Microsoft SQL Server Linux. Now I'm going to stop this container. So Docker stop, and then I need to add the container ID. We can only use the first 3 or 4 letters, so E8CF. Now, one of the issues that you may run into is that you run the SQL Server image, but it automatically terminates. So when you run Docker PS, you don't see anything. And then you can run Docker PS-A to see all the previous containers. And here you can see I had this container that terminated 29 seconds ago. So that's one of the issues you may run into. So when you use the SQL Pro or SQL Server command line tools, the server is not running. Then you come to the terminal, you run Docker PS, and the container is not there. What happened? So let's simulate a scenario where you run into an issue. So I'm going to run the Docker again, but this time I'm going to use a weak password. So sudo docker run -e except _eula, set it to y. Another environment variable, SA password. I'm going to set it to 1234. Map the port, run it as a daemon, and here's the image name, Server Linux. Nothing happened here. We just got a container ID. So Docker PS, and the container is not there. It terminated automatically. So we need to find the log for this container and then copy it somewhere in our host machine. So let me go to desktop here, create a folder, log. Now I need the ID for the last container. So once again, Docker PS-A, which is short for all. Okay, so here's the last container ID, B35F. So now Docker CP, short for copy, B35F:, and our log is inside this path in the container, /var, /opt, /msql, /log, /error log. That's the name of the file. Now we want to copy this to the current folder. Now you can see here in this folder, we have this error log file. We can open this with VS Code or any other editors. So code, period. And here's our log. So if you scroll to the bottom of this log, you can see this error here, password validation failed. The password does not meet SQL Server password policy requirements. And that's the reason we couldn't start this container. All right, our environment is set up. Next, we're going to create our ASP.NET Core project.